Such a pretty song. Matovu by Eitan Katz on his first Unplugged album. We started that song yesterday, continuing it today. How's everybody doing? Modim l'simcha, a good moed. Tomorrow is the last of the intermediate days of Passover, and tomorrow night we go back into full festival mode with the final days of Passover. It's great to be with you. Let's light up the darkness. Recall that tomorrow's show, even though it's Thursday, is going to be like our usual Friday schedule. Tomorrow is at noon Pacific, like we normally do on Fridays. Friday, no class, because we'll be in the holiday. And then I can't remember, I published it on the schedule. I'll let you know tomorrow whether we're going to resume on Sunday or on Monday. The holiday ends Saturday night. We're definitely not going to do a show Saturday night. It's just going to be too much. So I think we're going to get back on schedule Sunday, but I need to check that. At any rate, who's with us today? I always appreciate it when people write in the comments where you're tuning in from. Sort of brings us together. I can welcome you. And when there's comments right at the top of the show, signals to the algorithm, show this to more people. Sharon, welcome from Lebanon, New Jersey. Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehud in South Carolina, Nancy in North Carolina, Bill in mid-Missouri, James in Indianapolis, Guy in Ohio. Paul in the Great Northwest, Bella in Florida, Paul in Chicago, Pauline in Chicagoland, Augusto in Hialeah. That's Florida, right? Sharon, I need help. My dad's yard site is when we will be in Las Vegas on Shabbos. Can anyone tell me where I can say Kaddish? I know there's a bunch of places in Summerlin, but you want it right in Vegas. Maybe Zach Plotzker can answer your question if he's listening right now. I'm sure there's a Chabad in Vegas, and God willing, you'll have that opportunity. David in South Bend, Indiana. Karen in Northern California. Sharon saying happy 5th day of the Omer. David, happy Passover. Rebecca in LA. Paula, thanks for letting me be a part of this beautiful family, and thank you for being a part of it. Quick question for the community from Bill. Is anyone else having buggy video, or is it just me? If it's me, I'm trying to fix it. So I think we're running okay today. We've had problems recently, but I'm not seeing any freezing going on either the Facebook or YouTube feeds, nor my monitor here, so hopefully we're good. Also welcome Ifra from Florida and BT from Quebec, as well as Julie in Melbourne, Florida, John in Maine. Welcome, everybody. All right. With God's help, we're going to get through the whole daf today. Today's page 44 here in Tractate Yevamos, the 14th volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 4. We're going to begin and complete Mishnah number 8 and open Mishnah number 9. Generally speaking, in these last two chapters, we've been applying the general principles of yibum that we learned in the first two chapters to specific situations. And it's been interesting because I've also picked up some what I would consider more general and basic principles of this whole body of law that it would have been nice if Rebbe had laid them out right at the top of these Mishnahs, and then we could build on them, but that is not how they organize the Mishnah. All right, Mishnah number 8. In a case of 4 brothers married to 4 women, and some of the brothers died childless, their wives thereby become Yevamos. If the eldest of the brothers who survived wished to consummate yibum with all of his Yevamos, he has permission to do so. These days, we don't allow a guy to marry more than one woman, but in ancient times, and according to Torah law, he could. So if one guy had several brothers, and they all were married and died prior to having children, so the one surviving brother, if he wanted to, and the widows wanted to, could marry all of them and perform yibum with all of them. In the case of one who was married to two women, and he died childless, so the intercourse, meaning the yibum or chalitzah, of either one of the wives with the surviving brother, the yavam, releases her rival wife or co-wife from the, meaning this, it's the same, right? We've been using those terms interchangeably, rival wife or co-wife. Releases her rival wife from the levirate bond, and the rival wife need not enter into yibum or perform chalitzah. Now here it's getting stated explicitly in the Mishnah. That's a principle that we've been using, for weeks and weeks here. That if a woman is released, if she's released either through chalitzah or yibum, her co-wife is exempt, needs perform neither yibum nor chalitzah. And we learned that right away in the opening Mishnah, but it was just one of the principles that the Gemara assumed was in play from the more specific, which wives exempt their co-wives due to forbidden relationships with the Yevam. And here's just the simple law that if a man had two wives and one of them it has become exempt, has had the levirate bond released either through yibum or chalitzah, so then her co-wife becomes exempt and needs to perform neither. Here it's actually stated, 43 pages into our journey through this tractate. And finally, if one of these women, one of these two women who were co-wives, if one of these women was fit to marry into the priesthood, meaning was fit to marry a Cohen. When are you not fit to marry a Cohen? If you're a divorcee or in some other way disqualified from marrying a Cohen. So if one of those women was fit to marry a Cohen and one was unfit, then if he performs chalitzah, he should perform chalitzah with the one who is unfit, rather than with the one who is fit for the priesthood, since doing so with the woman who is fit would needlessly disqualify her from marrying into the priesthood, because as we've seen many times, a chalutzah, a woman who has performed chalitzah with her yavam, is considered like a divorcee and therefore disqualified from marrying a priest if he wants to retain his position as a priest. But if the yavam consummates yibum, he may consummate yibum with the one who is fit, right? Because you're not rendering her unfit. A priest can marry a widow, so the fact that he's now basically going to become her second husband. She was married first to the brother who died childless. Now she performs yibum with his brother, so now she's got her second husband. As long as she doesn't get divorced from her second husband, she will remain fit to marry into the priesthood someday after this marriage, or if he himself is a Cohen. And that is Mishnah number 8. The Gemara. So the simple reading of the Mishnah's first clause implies that all four brothers died. Now you didn't hear me say that. You heard me say in a case of four brothers married to four women, and some of the brothers died childless, their wives thereby become yevamot. But that includes Rav Steinsaltz's elucidation, which is how I'm always reading to you Mishnahs and Gemaras. Right, and so if you look in the Koran or in the Art Scroll, both of them, it's not just an English translation, right? Where am I? The Mishnah down there. This is backwards to me, so I'm trying to get it up to the camera. But you see that there is text in bold and text not in bold. And so what happens is, when you're reading in one of these volumes, either by Koran Publishing Company or by the Art Scroll Publishing Company, you've got more than a translation. You've got an elucidation, meaning that either Rav Steinsaltz, who's one of the most talented and prolific commentators of the last 1,000 years, or in the case of Art Scroll, a whole team of rabbis working together. and they're teaching it to us, right? So there are words that are added, and of course, any translation as an interpretation, but an elucidation is especially so an interpretation. And they will generally interpret the text according to the most common and well-accepted understanding of these words, but as well as their own understanding. So if you'd only read the bold text, it would have said, 4 brothers married to 4 women and died. Right? So that's why you need the elucidation to understand that they're talking about a case of 4 brothers who are married to 4 women, and some of the brothers died childless, and then their wives thereby become Yevamos, and then that sets up the next set of bold, which would be if the eldest wished to consummate yibum with all, he has permission. Elucidated means if the eldest of the brothers who survived wished to consummate the levirate marriage with all of his yevamos, he has permission to do so. Right, so you can see how the elucidation helps us to understand it. So, the Gemara says, the simple reading of the Mishnah's first clause implied that all 4 brothers had died. And the Gemara questions this. Can it enter your mind to say that all 4 brothers died? If they all died, then who remains to consummate yibum? Rather, amend the Mishnah and say instead, 4 married men of a set of more than 4 brothers died. Right? So that's a different reading than how Rav Steinsaltz elucidated. Right? He said 4 brothers were married to 4 women and some lesser number of them died. Here the Mishnah, the Gemara is saying, okay, there were 4 who died out of at least 5 or more. We're still getting at the same meaning. There has to be some surviving brother, and he has the option of marrying all of them if he wishes. So the Gemara, so if they all died, then who remains to consummate? It must say instead, 4 married men of a set of more than 4 brothers died. And the Mishnah continues, if the eldest of them wished to consummate the yibum, the levirate marriage, with all of his yevamos, he has permission to do so. And the Gemara asks, do they actually leave him to do so? Isn't it taught in a baraisa? The verse states, Deuteronomy 25:8, and the elders of his city shall call him, which indicates that they, the elders, and not their agent, should call him, specifically make a direct communication with him to tell him what he has to do. And the verse continues in the Torah, and they speak to him. And this phrase teaches that they offer him advice that is appropriate for him, meaning they tell him, your brother died childless, you have a choice before you to perform yibum or chalitzah, and then which do they advise? The Bryce explains, appropriate advice means that if he was a young man, and she an elderly woman, or if he was an elderly man and she is a young woman, they say to him, what do you want with a young woman when you are elderly? Or what do you want with an elderly woman when you are young? Go after your own kind, i.e. a woman of a similar age, and do not place discord in your household that could be caused by marrying a woman of a significantly different age than you. And from the Barais, it is apparent that if consummating the levirate marriage will ultimately lead to contention between the couple, then it is preferable to perform chalitzah. Similarly, in the case of the Mishnah, marrying 4 women will likely lead to contention, imagine that, since it is difficult to support so many people, and poverty will lead to strife. Therefore, the yavam should not be allowed to consummate levirate marriages with all of them. Now, the Gemara qualifies the Mishnah's case. No, actually, it is necessary to teach that he has permission to consummate the levirate marriage with all of his yevamos in the case where it is possible for him to provide for all 4 women. Note, they're not saying that there's likely to be contention because you have 4 wives in your home. Only it's going to be contentious if you can't afford to support all these wives and all their children. The Gemara asks, if so, then the same should be true even if there are many more women as well. Why does the Mishnah specifically discuss a case of 4 women? If he's a fabulously wealthy man and he could afford to support 20 wives, why not? And the Gemara explains, the Mishnah teaches us good advice. In a case of up to 4 women, yes, if he can provide for all of them, then it is acceptable to marry all of them. But if there are any more than that, no, he should not, in order that he will be able to meet the conjugal rights of each woman at least once in each month. And we will learn elsewhere that depending on a man's profession, he has an obligation to provide his wife with the number of times of lovemaking that she would like. She is not obligated to provide lovemaking services for him, as it were, but he is obligated to provide for her. Quite an interesting and perhaps unexpected set of rights in a patriarchal system. He's obligated to please her. He personally has an obligation to procreate, and she's going to help him do that. We've learned elsewhere that the commandment to be fruitful and multiply, Beis Hillel say it's satisfied if you have if a man bears a son and a daughter, and Beis Shammai said he's obligated to produce at least 2 sons, and the law follows Hillel. But a woman is not obligated to procreate. It's very interesting. Why? Because when she's bearing children, there's danger to her. There's always danger in childbirth. And so if a woman does not want to bear children, she doesn't have to. But a man is obligated. Okay, but now just in terms of conjugal rights, right, just providing intercourse for her, he's obligated. And how often is he obligated? That actually depends on his profession. And we learn elsewhere that, for example, a sailor, who's often away at sea, well, he has to make sure to be home at least, I think, once in every 6 months. And a camel driver is like once a month. And here it says, a Torah scholar is expected to provide conjugal relations once a week. If he marries no more than 4 women, then that will ensure that each of his wives will receive their conjugal rights at least once a month. The Mishnah states, in the case of one who was married to 2 women and died childless, the intercourse or chalitzah of either one of them with the yavam releases her rival wife from the levirate bond. And the Gemara questions why the Mishnah considers only the possibility that he would do so with only one of the women, but let him instead consummate levirate marriages with both of them. And Rabbi Chia bar Abba said that Rabbi Yochanan said, the verse states that a yavam who performs chalitzah is referred to as the man who does not build his brother's house, singular. Deuteronomy 25:9. Now, the fact that the word house appears in the singular indicates that even had he chosen to consummate a levirate marriage, only one house may he build. By consummating a levirate marriage with one of his brother's wives, but he may not build 2 houses. And we've seen that halacha before, that if the brother who died childless had multiple wives, even if he wanted to and they wanted to, he is not permitted to perform yibum with both of them. He may only perform yibum or chalitzah, for that matter, with one of the wives, and then the other one is exempt. And the Gemara suggests, but let him perform chalitzah with both of them. Why does the Mishnah state that he does so with only one woman? And Mar Zutra Bar Tovia said, the verse states that following the chalitzah, the man is called the house of him who had his shoe removed, because the chalitzah ceremony is actually, she takes the shoe off his foot. It's just part of the ritual. And the fact that the word house appears in the singular after in the ritual language of the chalitzah ceremony indicates that he performs chalitzah with only one house, i.e. only one of his brother's wives, and he does not perform chalitzah with 2 houses. The Gemara suggests, but let him consummate the levirate marriage with one and perform chalitzah with the other. Why don't we allow that? And the Gemara explains that the verse states, if the man does not wish to take his yevama, which implies that with regard to anyone who performs chalitzah, were he to wish to, he could consummate the levirate marriage. And this teaches the principle that only one who is eligible for levirate marriage is eligible for chalitzah, but one who is ineligible for levirate marriage is ineligible for chalitzah. And since in the case of the Mishnah, if the Yavam consummated the levirate marriage with one of his brother's wives, he may not do so with the second, and consequently, he also may not perform chalitzah with the second. And that's why either yibum or chalitzah with one of the co-wives and the other is exempt. And furthermore, an additional reason that one may not do so is so that people should not say that the brother's house was partially built through yibum and partially released through chalitzah. The Gemara asks, and even if they will say that, what of it? The Gemara explains, if he first consummated the levirate marriage with one wife and subsequently performed chalitzah with the other wife, indeed, there is no reason not to do this. However, perhaps he might first perform chalitzah with one wife and subsequently consummate levirate marriage with the other. And by doing so, he was liable for a violation of the prohibition. He does not build his brother's house. The verse indicates that one who performs chalitzah has not built his brother's house and is therefore subsequently prohibited from even attempting to do so by consummating a levirate marriage with either the chalutzah or any of her rival wives. Once the yavam performs chalitzah with either the rival wives, it's over, and he may never marry or have relations with either of the co-wives. Then the prohibition kicks back in. You may not sleep, you may not marry your brother's wife, right? It's only yibum that overrides that. Now that he's performed chalitzah, yibum is off the table, and so one is prohibited to him as a chalutzah, and the other is prohibited as the co-wife of a chalutzah, and they both remain prohibited to him forever as his brother's wives. The Gemara asks, but since the Torah's description of levirate marriage mentions only a case in which the deceased brother had only one wife, say, when there is only one wife, the mitzvah of levirate marriage exists, but when there are two wives, the mitzvah of levirate marriage does not exist. Perhaps once there are two wives, there is no yibum and they're both exempt. How do we know this is not so? And the Gemara suggests a proof. If that were so, why do I need the halacha concerning a rival wife of a forbidden relation, which we started this tractate with, which is forbidden by the merciful one in the Torah? Now that even in the case of two women in general, where neither woman is a forbidden relation, you say that they are not eligible for chalitzah and yibum, is it necessary to say a rival wife of a forbidden relation is also forbidden? The fact that the Torah does prohibit a rival wife of a forbidden relation indicates that the mitzvah of levirate marriage does exist in a general case of two wives in which neither are a forbidden relation. And the Gemara objects, why not? Even if one assumes that there is no mitzvah of levirate marriage when the deceased brother had two wives, it is still necessary to teach the halacha concerning a rival wife of a forbidden relation, because it could enter your mind to say that since there is no possibility of consummating the levirate marriage with her, the forbidden relation stands outside the calculation, such that her presence is disregarded, and her rival wife should enter into levirate marriage as though she were the only wife. Therefore, the verse needs to teach us that the rival wife is forbidden. And in fact, that other possibility was the position of Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai disagree with the first Mishna of our tractate, right? That if a man died and he had two wives, and one of them is prohibited from marrying the yavam because, for example, she is his daughter, right? So if a man, if a guy has a brother who married his daughter, right? The girl married her uncle, which is permitted in the Torah, and he married some other woman as well. And then he died childless. So now there's two wives that come before his brother. One of them is his daughter, the brother's daughter. He can't marry her. She's a prohibited relation, a forbidden relation. And she exempts her co-wife. That's what we learned in the first Mishnah. But Beis Shammai would have said, obviously he can't marry his own daughter. She's exempt, but the co-wife has no such prohibition, so let him marry her. Beis Shammai would have ruled that way, but the law is according to Beis Hillel that a forbidden relation also exempts her co-wife. Now, rather, the repeated use of the phrase his yevama, in the verses concerning yibum amplifies the mitzvah of yibum so that it applies even when the deceased brother had more than one wife. They were just deriving that proof. We've been taking it as a given. And the Mishnah states, if one of these wives of the deceased brother was fit for the priesthood, and one of them was unfit, Chalitzah should not be performed with the fit woman, since doing so would needlessly disqualify her from the priesthood. Rav Yosef said that here, through this Mishna, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, taught the principle, and we've seen this before, that one should not perform an action that will needlessly disadvantage others, and so a person should not spill out water collected in his pit that he does not need when others are in need of it. Right? So since this Yavam could perform chalitzah with either of the two co-wives, one is fit for the priesthood, the other is not. He should do it with the one who's not fit to marry a priest, so that the one who is fit remains fit. Even though it's not like either one of those wives is contemplating marrying a priest at this time, the fact that she might want to do so in the future is enough to say to him, perform chalitzah with the one who could never marry a priest, so that the other one retains that possibility. And there's an interesting note about this from Rav Steinsaltz. He says, the Rid, another commentator, writes that this imperative should not be confused with the principle that one compels another to refrain from behavior characteristic of Sodom, like Sodom and Gomorrah. The principle teaches that if one denies another the use of his possessions, even though doing so would incur no loss or damage to himself, presumably no risk of loss even, then he should be forced to waive his rights to those possessions. And the Rid explains that that principle is limited to cases where there is a specific individual who wishes to use the possessions, not some hypothetical possibility that somebody out there might want to use them. The imperative here, however, goes much further in demanding that one not perform an action that could theoretically disadvantage an unidentified person in the future. If the wife who is fit to marry a priest might want to marry a priest someday, let's not remove that possibility, and that's why we have the Yavam perform chalitzah with the other wife who is unfit to marry a priest anyway. Accordingly, it would appear that one would not be forcibly compelled to act in this manner. And this is also how the Knesset Haggadolah rules. He explains the Gemara to be indicating the proper course of behavior for ethical living, but not a strict requirement. In contrast, a different commentator, Rabbeinu Yerucham, cited in Beis Yosef, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, understands the Gemara to actually require such behavior. And he therefore rules that one who refuses to a way that will avoid needlessly causing disadvantage to others should be excommunicated and flogged. Right? So that's not halacha. It didn't end up being Jewish law. But this idea that if you could, share some object or allow other people to use something in a way that causes you zero harm, zero loss, and I'm going to add zero risk of harm or loss, then you should do so. And if you don't, that is unethical, right? You won't be flogged because of it, but it is unethical to do that. Mishnah number 9. With regard to one who remarries his divorcee after she had been married to another man from whom she was then widowed or divorced. Now, we've mentioned this a bunch of times. You are not permitted to do that. If a man and woman are married and they get divorced, they are permitted to remarry unless she goes and marries some other man. And now we're going to learn, even if she betroths some other man, even if she didn't ever have sex with anyone else other than her ex-husband while she was a single woman, if she was betrothed even to another man, she may not come back into her previous marriage. They may not remarry. If she was married or betrothed or had sex outside of marriage with any other man, she's not allowed to, the guy, her first husband cannot remarry her. That is Jewish law. So what if they did it anyway? What if they violated Jewish law? Then what? That's what this Mishnah is going to address. With regard to one who remarries his divorcee after she had been married to another man from whom she was then widowed or divorced, or one who marries the woman with whom he performed chalitzah. Now we see why we're learning this in Tractate Yevamos. Or one who marries the woman with whom he performed chalitzah. You're not allowed to do that, but what if he did? Or one who marries a relative of his chalutzah. Since all such marriages are forbidden, he must divorce her, and the offspring born from such a union, right, that this remarriage of a couple that was married once, and then she was with another man, and then she came back and they married again. So they must be divorced, and if they had children from after they remarried, according to Rabbi Akiva, those children are mamzers, right? A very, very nasty, decree. I mean, for the child. I'm not saying Rabbi Akiva is nasty, but it would be a tragedy for any Jewish child to be decreed a mamzer, because then he can only marry other mamzers. He cannot marry just some other Jew. But this is only according to Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva holds that even the offspring from relations forbidden by a prohibition that is punishable by lashes, flogging, as opposed to kares, death at the hands of the heavenly court, the rabbis, the majorities say you're only a mamzer if you're the product of a union that if done intentionally, the parents would be subject to kares. Now the rabbis, the majority who overrule Rabbi Akiva, the rabbis say the offspring in those cases is not a mamzer. But they concede with regard to one who marries a relative of his divorcee, which is a union forbidden by a prohibition that does entail kares, that the offspring of that union is a mamzer. And they hold that only the offspring from relations forbidden by a prohibition entailing kares is a mamzer. But of course the rabbis agree with Rabbi Akiva that this couple that remarried against a prohibition must divorce, but at least their children are not mamzers. That was Mishnah number 9. Now the Gemara. The Gemara asks, but does Rabbi Akiva actually hold that with regard to one who marries a relative of his chalutzah, the offspring is a mamzer? Didn't Reish Lakish say, through the Mishnah here, that Rebbe taught that a sister of one's divorcee is forbidden by Torah law, whereas a sister of one's chalutzah is forbidden by rabbinic law? All right, so let's just keep that straight. A man can never marry a woman and her sister. Right? So obviously if you're married to a woman, you can't, even though you're allowed to have, but according to Torah law, multiple wives, you can't marry a woman and her sister. What if you divorce the first woman? Then can you marry her sister? No, you can't. You can never marry her sister while the first wife, even if she becomes your ex-wife, is alive. After she dies, then you would be permitted to marry her sister. But while she's alive, no. So you can't marry the relative of your divorcee, of your ex-wife. Here we're talking about a sister, but they extend that to some other relationships. Since a chalutzah is like a divorcee, if you perform chalitzah with a woman, you also can't marry her sister or other close relatives. But didn't Reish Lakish say that Rabbi Yehuda, that Rebbe taught that a sister of one's divorcee, that's prohibited by Torah law, but a sister of one's chalutzah is forbidden by rabbinic law? Prohibited by Torah law, if you did it anyway, that's a kares-bearing penalty. The child is a mamzer. Something prohibited by rabbinic law, the punishment of that is lashes. The offspring of that union is not a mamzer. So if a relative of one's chalutzah is forbidden by rabbinic law, how can the offspring of that union be a mamzer? And the Gemara concedes, amend the Mishnah and teach instead a relative of his divorcee. The Gemara notes, so too it is reasonable that this is the correct version of the Mishnah, as the latter clause teaches, but they concede in the case of one who marries a relative of his divorcee that the offspring is a mamzer. Now granted, if you say that Rabbi Akiva was talking about that case, well, this is consistent with that which the Mishnah teaches. They concede, which implies that they agree to a case already mentioned. However, if you say that he was not talking about that case, what could the phrase they concede possibly be referring to? Now the Gemara objects, well, but perhaps this phrase teaches us that the rabbis concede that the offspring from forbidden relations for which one is liable to receive charis is a mamzer. And the Gemara rejects this option. Well, this is already taught later on in the Mishna on page 49. Which offspring of forbidden relations has the status of a mamzer? It is the offspring of a union with any next of kin that is subject to a Torah prohibition that one should not engage in sexual relations with them. This is the statement of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shimon Hatimni says it is the offspring of a union with any forbidden relative for which one is liable to receive charis at the hand of heaven. And the halacha is in accordance with his statement. Since the Mishnah explicitly rules in accordance with Rabbi Shimon Hatimni, it would be unnecessary for the Mishnah here to teach that fact. But the Gemara persists. Perhaps the Tana taught us as an unattributed Mishnah that it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Hatimni to indicate that this is indeed the accepted halacha. The Gemara rejects this. If so, then let him teach other cases of forbidden relations for which one is liable to receive charis. Why do I need the Mishnah to specifically consider the case of a relative of one's divorcee? Rather, conclude from this that Rabbi Akiva indeed was talking about that case. The Gemara persists, but perhaps he was not actually talking about that case, but since Rabbi Akiva taught the cases of one who remarries his divorcee, or one who marries his chalutzah, or a relative of his chalutzah, the Mishnah also taught in the name of the rabbis the case of one who marries a relative of his divorcee, because it is a similar case. And the Gemara concedes that this would be an acceptable reading of the Mishnah. Rather, the Mishnah should not be amended. And with regard to the Gemara's original question as to how Rabbi Akiva could claim that the offspring from one's union with a relative of his chalutzah is a mamzer, if that union is forbidden only by rabbinic law, so then one must conclude that a relative of one's chalutzah is actually forbidden by Torah law, according to Rabbi Akiva, and therefore the offspring is a mamzer. Rabbi Chia bar Abba said that Rabbi Yochanan said that this is Rabbi Akiva's reasoning. As the verse states, the house of he who had his shoe removed. The verse called his relationship with the chalutzah his house, indicating that the chalutzah is considered as though she had been married to the yavam, and therefore her relative is forbidden to him by Torah law. Indeed, why would the rabbi say that the relative of the chalutzah does not have the same status as the relative of the divorcee, when we've been saying that just as a divorcee is prohibited to marry a priest, so is a chalutzah prohibited to marry a priest. They're deemed equivalent. So why would having sexual relations with the relative of a divorcee violate a Torah law, but having sexual relations with the relative of a chalutzah only violate a rabbinic law? Rabbi Akiva's reasoning sounds pretty good. Rav Yosef said that Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said, all agree in the case of one who remarries his divorcee that the offspring, even if not a mamzer, has flawed lineage. And if the offspring is a girl, she is unfit to marry into the priesthood. Now the Gemara clarifies, who is included by saying all agree? It is Shimon Hatimni. As although Shimon Hatimni said that the offspring of relations for which one is liable for violating a prohibition, punishable by lashes, is not a mamzer. Nevertheless, granted that Shimon Hatimni holds that he is not a mamzer, he would agree, however, that it is flawed lineage. And this is derived through a kal v'chomer inference from the law pertaining to a widow, like this. Just as in the case of a widow who is married to a high priest, which is prohibited, where the prohibition that pertains to her is not equally applicable to all, i.e. only a high priest is prohibited from marrying a widow. Other priests can marry a widow, they just can't marry a divorcee. And nevertheless, her child from that union is considered to have flawed lineage, then so too, with regard to this divorcee who married another man and is therefore prohibited from marrying her original husband, where the prohibition that pertains to her is equally applicable to all Jews, since no Jewish man can remarry a woman that he was once married to after she then went and married somebody else in between. As the prohibition to remarry one's divorcee after she was married to another man applies to all Jews, isn't it logical that her child from that union will have flawed lineage? And the Gemara raises a number of objections to this. Right? So just as in the case, if you're going to say that a widow who married a high priest, where the prohibition for her is only to marry that high priest, and nevertheless, if they did so, the child is considered flawed lineage, then this other woman who was married to a man, went and married, divorced, married someone else, came back, that prohibition applies to all Jewish men, and they violated it all the more so. That child should be considered flawed lineage. But the Gemara objects. The logic of this kal v'chomer inference can be refuted. What is true with regard to a widow where her union with a high priest is what makes her herself disqualified from subsequently marrying any priest, and if she is the daughter of a priest from eating his teruma, is not true with regard to a remarried divorcee, where her remarriage to another man is permitted and is not the cause of any further disqualification. She's only disqualified from marrying her own husband, not anyone else. Therefore, one case cannot be deduced from the other. And furthermore, Deuteronomy 24:4 states, she is an abomination. And this is written with regard to remarrying one's divorcee. And the emphasis on the word she teaches that only she is considered so. But her children are not abominations, and they have unflawed lineage. Right? So this woman was married to a man. They divorced. She went and married some other guy. They divorced or was widowed. She came back, married her first husband. She's not allowed to do that, but they did it. Now, then they have children, and these children are certainly this man's, right? There's no question of that. This child is not considered a mamzer according to the rabbis. They violate a prohibition, and we might even make them divorce, but the children do not have flawed lineage. Or at least they're not mamzers. Let's keep reading. And furthermore, it is taught in a baraisa with regard to one who remarries his divorcee, and one who marries his chalutzah, and one who marries a relative of his chalutzah. Rabbi Akiva says that one's betrothal of such a woman is not effective, and therefore, even if he attempts to do so, it is meaningless, and she does not require a bill of divorce from him in order to separate from him. Right? If she goes back to that first husband after being married to someone else, they're not allowed to get married, right? If they did get married, we make them divorce. In fact, according to Rabbi Akiva, if they just betrothed each other, we don't require a bill of divorce for that because it was a meaningless betrothal since she's prohibited to him. And if she has relations with him, she is rendered unfit and her child is unfit, and we force him to send her away. The rabbis say that one's betrothal with such a woman is effective, and therefore she does require a bill of divorce from him in order to break them up. And if she has relations with him, she remains fit and her child is fit. Now the Gemara clarifies, when the baraisa states that she and her child are rendered unfit, to whom are they unfit to be married? Is it not to the priesthood? No, it is to the congregation of Israel. If so, when the baraisa states she is fit, to whom is she fit to be married? If we say it is to the congregation of Israel, this is obvious. Could it be that because she engaged in forbidden sexual relations that she is rendered unfit from marrying into the congregation of Israel? Although by doing so she is rendered a zona, like a prostitute, that can disqualify her only from marrying a priest. Rather, is it not that the intention is that she is fit to marry into the priesthood? Now the Gemara suggests, and since in reference to her, the word fit in the baraisa means fit for the priesthood, it follows that for the child as well, the word fit means fit for the priesthood. That doesn't mean a mamzer, right? A mamzer is unfit to marry any Jew. Fit for the priesthood or unfit for the priesthood just means that somebody has flawed lineage, so they can't marry a priest, but can marry any other Jew. The word fit means fit for the priesthood. Now the Gemara objects. What? Are these cases comparable? This case is as it is, and that case is as it is. And although the two cases are juxtaposed in the baraisa, they need not be relating to the same issue. Rather, when referring to the mother, the baraisa mentions fitness for the priesthood. And when referring to the child, it mentions fitness for the congregation of Israel, meaning one who is fit for the congregation of Israel is not a mamzer. The Gemara notes, so too, it is reasonable to assume that the two clauses concern different issues. As the first clause teaches in the name of Rabbi Akiva, she is unfit and her child is unfit. When the first clause states, she is unfit, to whom is she unfit to be married? If we say the congregation of Israel, could it be that she engaged in forbidden sexual relations and then she was rendered unfit to marry the congregation of Israel? Meaning, no matter how bad you sinned by engaging in prohibited sexual practices, if you are not born a mamzer, you don't make yourself a mamzer, right? You can only be born a mamzer because you are the product of an illicit sexual union, punishable by charis. So if somebody is rendered unfit through their own actions, that can only mean rendered unfit to marry a priest or to eat teruma in a priest's household if she is a priest's daughter. Rather, is it not the intention that she is rendered unfit to marry into the priesthood? And when the first clause continues in state, and her child is unfit, well, to whom is she unfit to be married? If we say that it is to the priesthood, that would imply that the child is fit to marry into the congregation of Israel. However, this is untenable because didn't Rabbi Akiva himself say in the Mishna that the offspring of this prohibited union, that one who remarries a woman that he was once married to, then she was married to someone else and then comes back, Rabbi Akiva said this child is a mamzer and is unfit from entering the congregation of all Israel. Rather, it is obvious that the intention of the Baraisa is that the child is unfit even to marry into the congregation of Israel. So when the Baraisa is saying the mother is unfit and the child is unfit, it means different things. The mother is unfit to marry a priest. The child is unfit to marry any Jew because it's a mamzer. And since the first clause of the Baraisa, it is apparent that although two cases are juxtaposed, this case is as it is and that case is that it is. Having resolved the objection raised from the Baraisa, the Gemara returns to its preceding objection. And the objection raised from the verse, she is an abomination, in which the Gemara suggested that the emphasis on the word she teaches that only she is an abomination, in this case, unfit to marry a priest, but her children are not, can also be resolved as the emphasis on she could be interpreted differently to teach she is an abomination, but not her children are something or nothing, but rather her rival wife is not an abomination, right? When it says she is an abomination, we might be distinguishing her from her rival wife. She became an abomination by doing this, but her rival wife doesn't become an abomination. Why would she? And if they both fell together for levirate marriage, the Yevama may consummate the levirate marriage with her rival wife. However, it is possible that her children are in fact abominations and are unfit to marry into the priesthood. The Gemara concludes, however, although two of the objections were resolved, the objection to the logic of the Kal V'chomer inference from the case of a widow remains difficult. As the Gemara noted earlier, what is true with regard to a widow, where her union with a high priest is what makes her herself disqualified from subsequently marrying any priest? She was a widow who married a high priest. They shouldn't have done that. We make them divorce. But because she did that, she now is further disqualified from marrying any other priest. Even though normally a priest could marry a widow, high priest can't, regular priest can. But because this particular woman, who was already a widow, married a high priest, she, through that violating that prohibition, rendered herself unfit from marrying any priest. And if she is the daughter of a priest, from eating his teruma. Is it not true with regard to a remarried divorcee, where her remarriage to another man is permitted and is not the cause of any further disqualification? Therefore, there is no basis for assuming that the child of one who remarries his divorcee after she had been married to another man will have flawed lineage. And that is the ruling of the rabbis. Only Rabbi Akiva would be so harsh on this child. Rather, if this was stated, it was stated like this. Rav Yosef said that Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rebbe, said, all agree with regard to one who engages in intercourse with a forbidden relation for which one is liable to receive charis, that the offspring has flawed lineage. And the Gemara clarifies who is included by saying all agree. It is Rabbi Yehoshua. As although Rabbi Yehoshua said in the Mishna on page 49 that the offspring born from a union for which one is liable to receive kares is not a mamzer, nevertheless, granted that Rabbi Yehoshua holds that he is not a mamzer, he would agree, however, that he is of flawed lineage, right? So we're not going to use flawed lineage and mamzer interchangeably. Flawed lineage means can't marry a priest. Mamzer means can't marry any Jew who's not a mamzer. I'm almost done. If you have questions or comments, get them in. This is derived through a different kal v'chomer inference from the law of a widow, as follows. Just as in the case of a widow who is married to a high priest, where the prohibition that pertains to her is not equally applicable to all, i.e. only a high priest is prohibited from marrying a widow, and nevertheless, her child from that union will have flawed lineage, not a mamzer, but will be prohibited from marrying a priest. Then so too with regard to this woman, where the prohibition that pertains to her is equally applicable to all Jews, isn't it logical that her child from that union should have flawed lineage? And if you would say that the logic of this kal v'chomer inference would be refuted in a manner similar to the suggestion above, that what is true with regard to a widow who is herself disqualified from marrying a priest, that it is not true with regard to a woman who is forbidden by a prohibition for which one is liable to kares, that is not correct, because here too, once he has engaged in intercourse with her, he renders her a zona, and as such, she is disqualified from marrying into the priesthood. A lot of distinctions, a lot of reliance on the logic of those distinctions to be clear who is who and what is what. Okay. Let's go to questions. I see people talking about screen freezing, but it's not like the other day where it froze and just stayed frozen. It seems like maybe there was some interruptions. It drives me bananas. I do the same thing every day. It's the same system. Some days there's this freezing and some days not. I don't know why. I just don't know why. All right, let's go to questions or comments. On Yevamos 44, Sharon. King Solomon had hundreds of wives, and he was considered wise. Right? So, the sages only came later and said, what a man's conjugal obligations are, and therefore they limited that you should have more wives, then you can fulfill your obligations. But how wise was Solomon really? Even though he was the wisest man perhaps who ever lived, in this one area of having so many wives, he proved not to be so wise, because it was those wives that at the end, some of them came in and, weren't very close to their husband, didn't receive and partake of his wisdom, and set up temples of idolatry, and his own children were not able, his successor was a disastrous king who led to the kingdom being split. So, Solomon was so wise in so many areas, but in picking his wives, maybe not so much. Bill, presumably he slipped through the loophole of concubines, not wives, for most of them. Then again, Pharaoh's daughter was a wife, so much for wisdom. I guess, Bill, you agree with me. Okay, that's what we've got today. And with God's help, we will be together again tomorrow at noon, because we re-enter the final days of Passover, full festival mode tomorrow night.